Scripture and homosexuality has always been a tough topic to discuss. Verses from the Bible are the most common talking points in terms of shunning queer people, relationships, sex, etc. We see this all the time in contemporary times. Famous viral examples like the Westboro Baptist Church's picket signs or homophobic legislature backed by figures who believe it disrupts traditional holy values. Somehow, even with the world moving in a progressive direction, as same-sex marriage has been legalized in the US for almost 7 years, we as a community are still facing extensive pushback from religious folks. How are these interpretations still holding value in a progressive world? It is unfortunate. However, queer theologians are constantly trying to deconstruct and create interpretations of the Bible that include queer people. I'll be discussing the way in which certain biblical texts have historically perpetuated homophobia and heterosexism, but ending with optimism, as many important figures in the field of theology are trying to create a space in religious studies that allows those a part of the LGBTQ+ community to practice faith while feeling validated in their identity. First, I think it is important to understand the worlds of the text that interact as we interpret the Bible in various ways. The world of the text is what we see, the Bible itself, with all of its characters and themes, concepts, and settings. There are obvious tensions when reading that conflict with our personal worldviews. This is because there are two other worlds that often clash in conversations like queer theological discussion. 1, the world behind the text is very different from 2, the world in front of the text. Reason being, the world behind the text was the historical time period of the Bible where many of our contemporary terms were non-existent, such as terms for delineations of queer identities like lesbian, gay, trans, and bisexual. The world in front of the text allows for these conversations about gender, race, class, and sexuality, and how they intersect and can be applied to Scripture. With that being said, as we examine the text, we learn that clobber passages exist in Leviticus 18:21, Romans 1:18-32, 1 Corinthians 6:9, and 1 Timothy 1:10. They are often used to justify that heterosexuality is the norm and that deviating from that norm leads to sinful consequences. LGBTQ+ Bible scholars often state that the real meaning is at an intersection of the text and the person reading. The concept of the worlds of the text presumes that there is no one meaning, therefore it is up to the reader to construct interpretations of Scripture that best fit their current world in front of the text, knowing that God created them as equally as everyone else. We see in a lot of biblical scholarship that the translation of arsenokoitai is debated to either mean men who have sex with men or men who lie with boys, and because of the empty gap in understanding, LGBTQ+ scholars choose to lean towards the latter based on historical research. The circumstances that 1 Corinthians 6:9 exists under are also labeled as pederasty by progressive scholars. These interpretations flip the script to say that these passages are speaking on pedophilia and incest rather than explicit homosexuality. But it is clear that we have come to see that much of the issue of homosexuality in Christianity has to do with sexual behavior, as seen in Leviticus and the use of the word sodomy in Christian spaces. As we've learned, though, it overlaps with the enforcement of gender norms. There are reinforced aspects of the male-female hierarchy within the fixation on sex. Scholar Dale Martin, in his text on heterosexism, states, the aspects of same-sex intercourse assumed to be unnatural are A, a disruption of the male-female hierarchy, and B, sexual intercourse that does not have procreation as its goal. It is a disruption to the nuclear family. This is where the root of the issue lies for some Christians. The Bible sees men as a reflection of God and women as essentially a reflection of men. Women were given the ability to procreate as a punishment and must fulfill it. Deviating from this is therefore wrong, and being feminized in the name of homosexual sex is humiliating for a man if they are allowing themselves to be any less than their godly reflection. Paul has an issue with this, with the word malakos often translating as effeminate. Allowing yourself to be unnaturally penetrated in what would be the same lower position as a woman poses a threat to masculinity. Paul says in Romans that their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and then the men giving up their natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. They committed shameless acts. There is more talk here about male-male relationships, while the word unnatural is only used for women. In my own personal interpretation, this can potentially be taken to relate to how lesbianism has existed in society as a fluke, attention-seeking, with the potential of not even being real and thus the least natural. As always, this is the heterosexist view at work, and lesbianism will always be a difficult sexuality for people to swallow because of how it's the only one that does not center men. The work of LGBTQ+ biblical scholar Bernadette Bruton, writer of Love Between Women, interprets Paul's conscience here as critiquing Roman culture. Women stepping outside of gender norms in general poses an issue to Paul, as he uses the word unnatural for anything that deviates from such. Thus, the openness of women participating in lustful sex with both male male and female partners is not approved for either to Paul. Although it does not make things 100% better, as all these interpretations do not, it is used to debunk explicit condemnation of queer individuals. While the clobber passages are problematic and it can be beneficial for scholars to go back and revise them, it is also very helpful for queer Christians to look at certain texts that can be interpreted as pro-gay or gender non-conforming. There are instances of flipped gender roles, like that of Jacob preferring to be with his mother at home and taking on feminine activities such as cooking in Genesis 25. And within the same family, Joseph, Jacob's son, was given an ornate robe later in Genesis, where the original Hebrew word for the robe, kerane pasim, is meant to mean the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore in 2 Samuel 3:18. Scholar Peterson Toscano is very passionate about sharing this narrative through live performance. As he unlearns decades of conversion therapy, unveiling representation such as this within scripture allows for free expression as a queer Christian. In terms of same-sex relationships, David and Jonathan, who are, of course, taught to be best friends, speak to each other saying things like, "Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of any woman," in 2 Samuel 1:26. Whatever these passages may have meant for the world behind the text does not matter for LGBTQ+ Christians who are seeking validation and representation from the Bible. As all interpreted meaning is fair game, it is fair to say that people like David and Jonathan, along with Ruth and Naomi, bring queer people a reflection of themselves into the text. This is similar to the way the biblical character of Hagar has been a figure of hope and liberation for Black Christians. With all the negativity that exists as certain Christians continue to weaponize clobber passages, there are ways that LGBTQ+ scholars are working to change these narratives. The Society of Biblical Scholars has conferences each year with upwards of 8,500 attendees, and LGBTQ+ Christian scholars come to share their wisdom and create new modern interpretations that are inclusive and careful to undo the harm done by conservative Christians. The gay imagination, as coined by Dale Martin, allows us to be imaginative and interpret biblical characters and concepts in ways that reflect the queer experience. Plus, for Catholics, it is especially monumental that the Pope is accepting of queer Christians. Only just last week did he say that God is Father, and he does not disown any of his children. For a figure that close to God to say something about not disowning queer folks for their sexuality is important language, as many families do kick out their children for these reasons. We're seeing things like the Don't Say Gay bill in the news so often that we forget about some of the positive work being done in order for people to unlearn the hatred that has progressed in Christian circles and leaked into general homophobic rhetoric. Most importantly, as we validate LGBTQ+ interpretation within Scripture, there is always this to remember. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Genesis 1:27.